Hi everyone, Titus here for the final video of our smoke grenade series, and in this one, we'll finish up the character blueprint code to allow us to actually throw our object, spawn our visual effects, and apply our post-processing to the heads-up display. Alright, let's jump right into it. Alright, so in the last one we basically created the blueprints for the grenades. We don't have a way to throw them, so I just placed them in the scene here, but we have them spawning trigger boxes and some smoke and some sounds. We also have the sound cut out after so much time. And then we have the actor and the colliders all delete out, and then visual effect stops. So, but now we need a way to actually throw it. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to delete these objects. I'm going to come into our first person character. If you're playing on the third person template, this would be your third person template, or whatever you're using. And then we're basically going to come up the components tree, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a scene component. You don't have to use a scene component. You could use like an arrow or some other empty, just anything really. We just need a reference point. And then I'm going to title this as our throw location or throw lock. And then I'm going to place it where I want the grenade to spawn for the player, which is usually right out in front, and they're going to be right-handed, so maybe somewhere around there. That looks pretty good. The next component we're going to need is a post-process effect. So if you search for post, you can choose post-process. We can just call this pp underscore smoke. And then I don't really want it under the throw location. I'll just parent it under the capsule component, should be fine. In the details panel, you want to find the rendering features and expand that out. There'll be a post-process materials, expand that out, hit the plus sign, and then we're going to choose an asset reference. And this will be the material we created in the beginning of the series called pp underscore smoke. If you remember, that was this one right here. And this is basically just giving us a way, so we basically have a way to reference this this post-process effect in the actual first-person character. Now, normally, you would want to scale the volume to encompass the character, but if you have the unbound checked, it'll basically set it to infinite, so the effect's going to impact the player no matter where they are. Now, another way you could do this is you could actually come in your level editor, and you can add a post-process volume actually inside the level, and you can move it around and scale it so the effect would only impact the player when they're inside that region. But since this effect is basically going to be like a smoke effect where it can affect them anywhere, it makes more sense just to attach it to the player character and just have it follow them around. But just giving you, there are other, depending on your project, maybe you're trying to set up where, this post-process would only play in a certain part of your map. That would be a way to do it. So, coming back here, we can then go into our event graph, and you just want to find an empty space in your graph, and we're going to create the code to actually throw the grenade. So I'm just going to do a keyboard event to make it simple. So I'll search keyboard, and I'm going to look for the G key. G for grenade makes sense. So I can drag that down, and then I can get a reference to my throw location, drag it into the map, or the graph editor, I should say. You can pull off that and do get world location. And then off the press, we can do a spawn actor from class. And you probably recognize this node from the last one. The class we're going to do is going to be our BP smoke grenade. So basically this thing right here. So BP smoke grenade. We'll run a search for that right there. Now the transform we're going to have to right click and split it. We're not going to be messing with the rotation or the scale, so we can just plug in our world location into the spawn location, and that way it'll spawn the grenade right at our throw location, which is this point right here in the viewport. So now at this point we should have code that is going to create this blueprint when the G key is pressed. If we go into the grenade at the begin play, when this thing is created, it's going to find the first person camera and it's going to add a throwing distance and a rotation as a simulated physics to our static mesh. So in other words, in the first person character, we just simply spawn the object, and then the object code is to add an impulse or a throwing distance based on some forward vector that we're referencing from the first person. So basically one spawning and then the grenade is actually throwing itself, for lack of a better way to describe it. But let's go ahead and hit play, and let's see if we get anything. So we'll hit G, and then you can see we actually have a grenade tossing out, and it's getting some tumble. And the tumble should be relatively random. Yep, you can see it wasn't as bad that time. And then the grenade's pretty much taking care of all the other code. You see the trail Niagara systems coming out. And then it's spawning our trigger box. And if we actually enter in the trigger, whoops, I just missed it. If we enter in the trigger box, we can see it says smoked. If I'm not in the trigger box, you're going to see it actually says BP smoke grenade 7. That means it hit part of the other object. So it is referencing other objects, but when it references me, it'll actually say smoked. Kind of like that. So far so good. Now we can actually come in and tidy up the rest of the code. So the next thing we're going to do, go back into the first person character. We can just select everything here and do a comment. And it's just the grenade toss. All right. Now the next step is we need to create a function for what happens when we get smoked. So that's easy enough. We just find an empty space. We'll right click and do custom event. And you'll see an option to add a custom event. We'll title it Get Smoked. And then we also need a secondary custom event to basically reverse the effects of the first one. I mean, you could tie everything else into the same function and just do it on a timer. A lot of different ways you can do it. I prefer to do it this way with this particular code just because I find it's more reliable. So we'll do another custom event. And smoke end, or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter too much. In order to effectively go through these functions, we're going to want to do some Boolean checks. The first one, we'll create a new Boolean, and it'll be is smoked ? And then another variable we'll probably want is going to be the like the penalty length. So we can create a new one and just maybe call smoke length, and we'll switch that to a float. Compile and save. For the smoke length, I think starting at a 5-second penalty is probably good. And then is smoked, we're going to set it to false starting off, obviously. And then coming off the first function, well, actually before we write any code, if you remember in the box collider, so this thing right here, we have the code when it overlaps, we can delete these print strings, and this thing here. When it's successful, we can actually drag off this and do a reference to our get smoked function now. Because this get smoked function exists, we can reference it in the box collider blueprint. And then on a successful cast, it'll actually trigger that function, and then it'll run the code on whatever we put in our first person character here. So let's go ahead and do a couple branch checks. So I'll add 2 here. And then the check is going to be if they are is smoked. And then we will hook up these execution pins. All right, so obviously, well, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but I'm gonna set up this code to where if the player gets smoked, it's gonna start the penalty. So in this case, our penalty length is 5 seconds. In the event that they hit the trigger again while they're already smoked, it's not going to reset the penalty. It's simply going to play it out, and they have to get unsmoked before they can get smoked again. Depending on your implementation, you may prefer to be able to stack an effect, so you may need to alter your code slightly depending on what you're going for. But for me, I'm going to do it this way. So I'll set the is smoked, and I'm going to set it to true. And if the player is smoked, I only want to run this code when it's false. So I don't want to do another smoke. So basically I don't want to penalize them if they're already penalized. So on the false condition, I'll set it to true. And then on the smoke end, I only want to run this if they're already smoked, because I don't want to call smoke end if they're not smoked, right? That doesn't really make sense. And then I'm going to set this to false on this side. Now the other thing we can do is we can get a reference to our character movement. So we can drag a couple references down here. And then one thing I like to do is I like to set the max walk speed. So the I think the max walk speed is 600 centimeters per second. So you can do set max walk speed, and then I can control D to duplicate that. And when they get smoked, I can slow them down by half, so set it to 300. And then when we unsmoke them, we can set it back to 600. It's kind of like that. So that already penalizes their movement. The next thing I want to do is I want to spawn a sound. So I'll drag off here and do spawn sound 2D. This one is going to be my gas mask. I think I have maybe, yeah, mass breathing, this one right here. Okay, so I got another mass breathing. I'm gonna make that real low though, because it's quite loud. And the reason I'm doing a spawn is because I need a way to be able to stop the breathing effect. So I can, on the return value, I can promote that to a variable, and I'll just call this gas mask audio, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter too much. On this one, on the end function, we can drag out the get gas mask audio, and then we can simply just call a stop. Or if you wanted, you could do a fade out, a stop or a fade out, you know, doesn't really matter. And then I can fade it out over maybe 1 second, so it just kind of goes away. Now to trigger the post-process effect, that is just simply setting the scalar parameter value. So if you do set scalar parameter value here, the parameter collection, if you remember, was the PC underscore dataset. And the parameter name, I believe we named it to alpha. Under our materials, we have our PC dataset here. That's the name of the material collection. And then our scalar parameter was called alpha right here. And I think we did that in like the first video. So under the parameter collection, we'll set that to alpha. And remember, when they're fully smoked, the value is 1. When they're not smoked, the value is 0. So I'm just going to duplicate this. I'll set this to 0. And then we can just hook up these execution pins like so. And then continue with our functions. The next thing I'll want to do is I want to delay. And then I'm going to delay based on the penalty amount. So in this case, this would be the smoke length. So you can just drag that in there. And you can adjust that depending on what playstyle you're looking for. At the end of this function, I then want to call smoke end. So at the end of this one, it'll basically trigger the smoke end function, and it'll run through this code right here. And we'll want to hook up this player movement there. And if I did this right, this should work. So let's compile, save. Now if I hit play, grab my gun, I can hit G. It's going to spawn my grenade. Spawns my trigger box. I hit the trigger box. My vision gets blurred. And then after 5 seconds, it should restore. If I hit it again, it's blurry. And then it should restore after 5 seconds. The other thing we need to check is after we spawn, can we reset the smoke effect? It shouldn't. So it shouldn't be like an additional 5 seconds. It should be relatively quick. So even though I'm hitting this multiple times, the effect's gonna only go for 5 seconds. But again, that's depending on whatever implementation you're looking for, right? Now, one thing you may have noticed is the effect was rather harsh on the transition. So it turns on and off like very harshly, so you can kind of notice that. If you want to smooth that out, it is easy enough. I usually just do that with a timeline. So we can come off here and drag off this pin, search timeline, and you'll see a add timeline function. And then we can just call this smoke effect, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. Double click it to actually edit it. For the timeline, I would probably only do like 1 second. I don't trust timelines because they're not as reliable. So if you do like lengths and you're using delays, things may not line up. So I usually use my timelines very quickly, and I set my penalties and float values elsewhere. But you could technically do the penalty in here. It's just for the most part, you just want to test out your game quite a bit to make sure it's working correctly. We're going to add a track and do a float track. We'll title it alpha because we're only modifying in alpha. And remember, we're really only modifying the parameter value, which is a value between 0 and 1. So we can just add 2 keyframes. The first keyframe is going to be 0, 0. The second keyframe is going to be 1, 1. Then we can frame this. You can also right click and do auto, so it's a nice smooth transition between them. So it's kind of basically going to lerp. Compile and save. And then what you do is under the alpha value, you'll actually put this in here. Bring the scalar down over here. And instead of setting the scalar down here on the actual end of the smoke function, you would delete that and instead plug this execution pin on the reverse from end. And that's actually going to use the same, because it's using the same values, so it's going to work without issue. And you don't have to worry about waiting on the delay or the smoke end, because that's going to be checked on the Boolean and it's not going to execute again. So that should actually work fine. So if we compile and we save, then we can hit play and grab our gun. And if we throw our grenade out, spawns here, we can see the effect is pretty harsh. Let's see if it eases out. And that's a much smoother transition. So nice and easy. And that's just your timeline. So now a lot of the quick, where it's going in and out quickly, that has to do with the timeline stuff. So that's why I usually Actually, switching this play from start every time would probably fix that. But for the most part, that's basically it. So you're able to trigger the post-process effect just with using a timeline and setting the scalar parameter just through an alpha. So that works pretty good. And then you can just comment this all out and call it the smoke effect. So pretty basic, just slows the movement down, puts a blur on the screen, and then after some penalty amount, it takes it off. Alright, good people, this concludes the Smoke Grenade series. I hope you found informative value in the topic that you can apply in your own projects. If you have any questions or ideas on future topics you want to see covered, please post them down below. I'll do my best to accommodate them into video format, but as always, thanks for watching, consider subscribing, and see you on the next one.